Right, so there's this concept of markedness, and I've been asked a lot recently about what does that really mean? How do we know something is marked? One definition that we come across is that an unmarked property in language is more basic. Fine, but what does that mean? Like, how do we detect that? How do we detect that it's more basic? What does it mean? Now, the idea of markedness is part of a general linguistic search for universal patterns of language. We discover markedness and interpret it differently depending on what aspect of language that's being studied. And the really cool part about it is that often when we study markedness in, say, language change, historical linguistics, and we study it in language acquisition, and maybe we study it in cross-linguistic comparison, the things that show up as marked by their different criteria tend to be the same things. And that's encouraging. It suggests that maybe there's something meaningful underlying all of those different ways that markedness or more basic, being more basic, comes about. There's something behind that. But for now, why don't we look at some of these different things? So I've got a list of 4 criteria that I want to mention that we can use to identify markedness. So the first one is something that's more common across languages we call unmarked or less marked. So for example, over 90% of the world's languages have a word order that prefers to put the subject before the object in a sentence. And so the inference then is that having the subject before the object, that's an unmarked word order. Another criterion is something is more common within a language. Okay, so to take a different example, more English consonants have the alveolar place of articulation than any other place of articulation. So that suggests that alveolar is a less marked place of articulation than others. A third criterion is if something is learned earlier in the language acquisition process by children, then it's more unmarked. So for example, children learn stops like p and t before they learn approximants like l and So this tells us that perhaps stops are less marked than approximants. And the fourth criterion that I want to throw out there is unmarked things are less likely to be lost in processes of language change over time or in the context of language disorders. So for example, historically, English used to have grammatical gender on all of its nouns and pronouns. It lost grammatical gender on most of the nouns, but retained it on the third person pronouns, he and she and it, right? So that suggests that maybe gender marking on pronouns is less marked than gender marking on nouns. And we could talk about, one of these observations, say alveolar consonants being more common in English. Alveolar consonants are also more common across the world's languages. Alveolar consonants, that's a place of articulation that's often learned early compared to, say, velar place of articulation or post-alveolar place of articulation. And I don't know as much about place of articulation changes in historical or language disorder contexts, so I can't speak to that, but we do have a sort of convergence. And so as we build up an inventory of things that look more marked and things that look less marked, that guides how linguists build their theories, because a theory will often have some structural properties that indicate, less marked things are going to behave differently than more marked things, because as we observe them, they tend to behave differently. The common alveolar sounds are also acquired more earlier, and they're less prone to change in language, context of language change, less prone to being lost, that sort of thing. Right. I think that's a good overview. There's a lot more to this, of course, but that gives you a general sense, at least, of where we're coming at as linguists when we talk about markedness in the features of language or the properties that languages have.